Welcome back to the Arise interview, a rather fraught edition by my own admission, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniegolu. So is Nigeria spending faster than it is earning and therefore falling deeper into deficit? And is the Nigerian government failing to demonstrate sound economic management by not tightening its purse strings? Well, according to the chairman of President Buhari's Economic Advisory Council, Nigeria's current public debt stock is unsustainable, with debt service to revenue at 98%. This rather damning assessment from the head of the council, charged with advising the government on economic matters, comes as President Buhari puts in yet another loan request with the National Assembly, seeking approval for more than $4 billion in external loans. It's also come as Nigeria's Debt Management Office disclosed that Nigeria's total public debt on both the state and federal government levels grew by nearly 8% between December 2020 and June 2021. Well, to help us make sense of what's going on with Nigeria's debt, I'm joined now in the studio by the macroeconomic policy analyst, Professor Ken Ife, who's also a lead consultant to ECOWAS, the World Bank and the African Development Bank. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Is Nigeria failing to demonstrate the required track record of sound economic management? Or put another way, is the government spending faster, as I mentioned there, than it is earning, and therefore falling deeper into deficit and now lurching towards a long-lasting default?
The answer to the first question about not demonstrating sound macroeconomic management is that's obviously not true, because if you consider what happened in 2005, when we were owing over $30 billion and 40% of that debt were as a result of infractions, unable to pay when it was due, penalties, and all of that. We don't have that kind of situation now. What we have is the product of all that experience was 2007 Fiscal Responsibility Act, which meant that there are now rules and laws guiding the exercise of that responsibility. And if you're asking me how do I now compare the two regimes, I would say that if you come to the issue of legality, the issue of prudence, financial accountability, there is more of that now. The debts are obviously, borrowing is in the exclusive legislative list. The law says you can only borrow on concessionary terms and for capital projects and for human resource development. Any other thing, it outlaws it. It says it's unlawful. So if anybody is lending us money, not on those terms, the law says it's unlawful. What I would say is that the current request that is being made by the president was foreseen by the fiscal strategy paper, and it was part of the 2018-2020 MTF, Medium-Term Expenditure Framework. It was captured in the borrowing plan. It was approved by National Assembly. It's always a protocol to still come back to them again at the point of borrowing. So that's why he's writing back to them again. So, and I have to say to you that more borrowing will come, because we still have 2021 to 2024 MTF. So there is more coming. But whether what we have done is reasonable, legal, I would say that it is.
Well,
but what I don't feel comfortable with is the way it was put in the paper. You couldn't be discussing the state of the economy and judging it with one macroeconomic parameter, which is debt sustainability, without regard to all other parameters and without regard to actually what was that money being used for. And how soon would we get out of that net? And all of those discussions never hit the table.
Well, I mean, the point is that he was giving an address, and not everything he said was, obviously this is a newspaper, the newspapers condensed it, but I think the knob of it is that Mr. Salami's assessment stands as an accusation against the Buhari administration of failing to curb Nigeria's spending and of ignoring the impact that this large-scale borrowing could have on this country's future. And he's the chairman of President Buhari's Economic Advisory Council. So this is not somebody who's just making empty sort of statements. I mean, he comes with a lot of credibility.
He's entitled to his view, but unfortunately I don't share all of that. Now, the challenges that we faced as a country were existential. The security challenges were existential. If, do nothing is not an option. We would be overrun by terrorists, bandits, kidnappers. The whole country would be overrun. Just what happened in Afghanistan would happen in Nigeria if we do nothing. Then COVID was an existential problem. Many people were dying in thousands. If you do nothing, many more people would have died and it would have spread. We were promised 20% of our population free vaccine. Where are they? We would have been getting 40 million vaccines free from international promise. Where is it? We've only got only 4 million. We would have to find money to buy vaccines to save more lives. Then unemployment, you do nothing, no public works program. Unemployment will drag all our boys and girls in the street and they'll bring down the government. So the challenges are just not the ones. If you look at the infrastructure for which a lot of this money were borrowed, the last investment in rail tracks was in 1927. And now see how expensive it is to build rail tracks, and then see the benefit of doing that. Kaduna to Abuja to Kaduna, see how happy people are using that track. Lagos to Ibadan. If you don't have Lagos to Ibadan rail, you couldn't conceive of building a deep sea port in Lekki. How could you do that? That capacity is more than all the existing seaports put together. You must have a rail to remove the goods. So otherwise, you can forget Lagos as a viable economy. So what it is being, and if you look at all the federal roads all over the country, many of them haven't been completed, but there are people walking in all the roads. That wasn't the case before the administration. So what I'm saying, in fact, we should focus on what was the outcome of this debt, and how soon would we get out of it, and what is government actually doing about the debt. If for 20 years we've been going up and down on PIB, but the government had courage to sign that bill. And what does that mean, Bill? FIRS tells us that next year they're expecting twice more revenue, over 10 trillion. That means more money will come in being able to repay the loan.
Right. Well,
and the same goes for all other areas. We know that the challenge, you see, there are no simple solutions. We are the lowest revenue to GDP in Africa, 6 to 7%. But if you want to double that overnight, it means you have to double the tax on everybody, and you can't do that. It's not sustainable.
Well, first of all, for those in our audience who may not be on top of things, just very briefly explain what debt service to revenue ratio is, because it stands at the moment at nearly 98%. And that's part of the reason why the alarm is being raised. Okay.
There are two core debt ratios. One is debt to GDP.
Yes.
Which
is at about 35%.
Yes, which is about 35%. Yeah. But when you do add the overdraft from central bank, and which is 10 trillion, then that will go up. But it will still be below the threshold, because the international best practice, which is not in our constitution, not in our law yet, is 40% for economies like ours, but 60% for other countries that are far more developed. But the fact is that these economies are able to violate that and go to 100%, or even Japan is 223%, 250%, because they have infrastructure. And also, secondly, we have two dreams of our economy as per PricewaterhouseCoopers, that by 2030, our GDP will rise to 1.64 trillion and 2050, 6.4 trillion. Inconceivable that you could be looking at that kind of order of revenue when you don't build infrastructure to support that order of revenue. Now, the second ratio is debt service to revenue, government revenue.
Yes.
That is
and how that's much the one that's worrying.
That's the one that is very worrying.
Yeah.
And I must admit, it's very, very worrying, because the current revenue that the government is able to muster should not be used to pay all the debts. You know, it should be like a proportion, 40%.
Absolutely.
That's what it is. It's 40% is what is expected to be by benchmark. You know, but last year, this time last year, in the first quarter, 91% of the revenue was used to pay the debt. But at the end of the year, 2020, we finished at about 83% of the debt being used to service, or the revenue being used to service the debt. And what am I saying? Even though today you saw the spike, it's just a snapshot in time. You just have you saw 98%, yes? But by towards the end of the year, you will see that will come down because there is more revenue coming in from this point onwards, as it happened last year. Secondly, I have no reason to believe that the government may not reach their objective. Their objective is 46.8% debt service to their revenue projected. So they might
projected by
that's what
to
they project in
by
the budget.
when?
In the budget this year.
Right. Okay.
They might shoot above that, but I have no reason to believe that it will not happen. And I'm just beginning to give you some examples of how government is ramping up revenue from all kinds of sources. You've seen it. You've seen all licenses are going up, driving, everything is going up.
But the thing is, looking at those figures that Dr. Salami talks about, I mean, they look, by your own admission, they look frightening. I mean, according to him, between 2015 and 2020, Nigeria's overall expenditure grew by 102%, while the country's revenue increased by just 15%. So clearly, spending is much more than earning. I mean, how worried should we be?
Well, ordinarily, I would be worried, but when you take a bigger picture, if you look at the bigger picture, I don't see that as a cause for serious alarm, because you have to. Our GDP was also growing, is almost double over the same time frame, and the economic activities have moved. You know, the population has grown. So many factors. You see, this is what I started with. If you are talking about the state of the economy, you have to look at more macroeconomic variables than just one, and then you can start so that people can see beyond that figure. Otherwise, you just frighten everybody, and more capital flight will continue.
Yeah, but you see, the ineluctable fact is that the expenditure grew by 102%. Whatever reasons are responsible for that growth, it is a figure that when you compare it to the revenue that increased by just 15% by any standard, that's a worrying development.
It is, but look at what was the cost. The leakages, over $8 billion every year is lost in illicit transfers. We know that. Africa, 84 billion. You know that I was in the Senate the other day, and they were talking about leakages, and then also they were talking about the waivers, the tax waivers being given. That when you add all that together, they're actually more than the revenue. So that revenue would have doubled. And then you start looking at issues like I've just told you about what is happening to our oil. You know, we get the foreign income we get, we use it to pay for crude to go out to be and processed and paid for. And after all of that, you still come and do over 100 billion naira in subsidy. So
yeah, but that's been the same problem that Nigeria has had for years. So there's no change being made in that direction.
No change is made because at one point we thought it was 30 million liters. Now it's 93 million liters. The number has tripled. And then you've now seen the unlocking of the whole thing in the oil industry by the new PIA. And now we are now seeing the possibility that more revenue will now come from all angles. So the worst is over, to be honest, in that respect.
Please stay with us, because it's always brilliant talking with you and tapping your huge analytical skills. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the macroeconomic policy analyst, Professor Ken Ife, who is talking to us about Nigeria's growing debt profile. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyegolu. Now, if you haven't seen today's edition of This Day newspaper, then I'd urge you to get hold of a copy. Its front page is headlined with a stark analysis of Nigeria's current public debt stock, which the respected economist, Dr. Doyin Salami, says is unsustainable. Dr. Salami, of course, just happens to be chairman of President Buhari's Economic Advisory Council, so the alarm he's raising is not to be taken lightly. He suggests that while overall government expenditure in Nigeria has grown by 102% from 5 trillion to 10.1 trillion between 2015 and 2020, revenue increased by just 15%, largely because of domestic production and investment constraints, as well as a low tax base and limited efforts to explore and unlock opportunities for revenue generation at state level, amongst others. And the macroeconomic policy analyst, Professor Ken Ife, who's also a lead consultant to ECOWAS, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank, is still with me in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us.
Thank you.
So I guess the question must be, why is revenue increasing at such a low rate in a country with such a large population and with the potential for much bigger production?
Well, I think Doyin has mentioned, Dr. Doyin has mentioned the state component of it. And you've seen that some states like Lagos that were aggressive and brought technology to bear had revenues
that is true.
And quadruple. And many states are struggling to do this. And we're trying to help them using, obviously, the Fiscal Responsibility Act and all of that, trying to persuade them to go down that route. But I also say that part of the challenge that we have as a country is this. Africa, there are only 90 million MSMEs in Africa. Nigeria has 42 million of those, nearly half. So how could Nigeria be 18% of Africa, 18% of GDP of Nigeria? Nigeria's GDP is 18%, but on entrepreneurship, we are many times more, which means is a big area of competitive advantage. But then when you look at the tax burden, you look at the tax, we are the lowest on paper. But when you look at implicit tax, where you take into account all kinds of tax that they have to carry, we are far the highest. The tax burden on our MSMEs is far the highest. So how far can you go in taxing them? So that the challenge will now be to widen the base rather than hit them more.
Absolutely.
And you can even see in 2019 Finance Act, they exited them from tax until they have a turnover of 25 million and above. Okay? So that tells you the constraint that the government is having in having to simply overnight double the tax. And so they are looking at other ways, and they're getting even voluntary tax assessment for individuals to use them to access, to widen the participation. Then you also come and look at inefficiencies in the collection, inefficiencies in the leakages. The leakages are, I mean, they're using systems to tackle them. They have IPPIS, which is the personnel payroll system. They have the GIF mix. And when they ran that payroll over the BVN, they saw one person with 46 bank accounts, collecting people's salary. So they're using technology in many ways to improve the collection and then also to minimize the leakage in the system. The leakages are horrendous. Then I also mentioned the fact that a lot of the money is being given away as tax waivers to some of the big time manufacturers. And then again, government is correcting that. And then other areas like NMPC has been tackled, boldly, in such a way that we are unlocking twice more revenue from restructuring them, and then having them just go and live with 10% of the revenue rather than handle 100% of the revenue. So all of these take time, but they're happening. And these things are happening because of the situation we are facing. But then it's a bit unfair to simply judge the whole economy by what has just happened last year. Nobody foresaw COVID coming, and for many countries are still in recession. We had to, in March, when the COVID hit Nigeria, the Minister of Finance said that the budget is going to be hit by 60%. And so you could imagine the misery in people's eyes and the unemployment, but eventually we fought our way out and spent more than the budget by the end of 2020. Plus the help from the National Assembly by spreading the first quarter that enabled us to spend more on capital projects. So And then you had a quantitative fiscal and monetary policy response from both CBN and very, very coordinated, where you have 3.5 trillion on the table from the CBN side, monetary policy side, and then 2.3 on the fiscal side. So all of them work together to quickly exit us from recession in one quarter.
Right. I have to say
you can't be doing this by not borrowing money. Yeah. When you have, there's nothing you can do without investment. If you are fighting security, you have to invest in equipment. You have to invest.
Obviously.
And then for you to invest, first of all, you have to use money. You save. You have no saving. And if you don't have any saving, you have to borrow. But the law says you can only borrow on concessionary terms over a longer time frame, and for capital projects and human resource development. Obviously, health is human resource. Employment is human resource. Education is human resource. And I tell you something. Once we all agree that privatization is just the quickest way, PPP and all of that, PPP is constrained in certain area. For example, all this infrastructure that federal has to do, you have to build it before you privatize it.
Yes, absolutely.
You have to invest in the rail before you get the investors to come to drive the, to run the train. But
what about
in health? You have to invest on health. You can't sack health workers. In universities, private universities are coming in, but still have to maintain your minimum exposure, and then invite PPP at the service level.
Right.
So that investment has to be made.
Yes, but is that investment being made? And is there a sense of urgency that accompanies things? That's a separate question. Let me ask you about foreign direct investment. How much is that being constrained in Nigeria by things like policy inconsistency, macroeconomic instability, because the FDI inflow seems incredibly low for a country like Nigeria that should be attracting a heck of a lot more.
Without a doubt. I have to tell you that we're struggling around $1 billion a year now, like last year. And this year, I don't even think we'll finish up to 1 billion in foreign direct investment.
Which is ridiculously small.
It's terrible. But then I have to say to you, look, you and me, we are diaspora. Now, why is it that we are bringing $26 billion, which is 11 times more than the
foreign direct investment?
No, it's even more. How many times more?
It's a lot
25
more.
times more than foreign direct investment. And the ODA, which is Overseas Development Assistance, is over 7.5 times more than that. And then, of course, when you compare it to which other, that is even sometimes more than government revenue. And why are we not, as a country, being very strategic in leveraging this resource? Because they've all come out of recession now, come out of COVID, and many people are bouncing back, and there's more of that money going to come. And then you saw what happened last year when CBN stepped in, when they saw the revenue, the remittance drop from 5 billion to 3.3 billion, they went in and asked IMTO, stop, put the money to the domiciliary account of the diaspora, and let them have the choice of where they want to buy the naira, whether from the bank or from the, And when they didn't play ball, they ordered the commercial banks to close their naira accounts. So they won't talk, and now started incentivizing them with $5, $3, $4 to bring them in. But having said that, some of those monies have gone invincible on the ground. You cannot pick in them. So apparently, I'm now seeing that money dropping. But there's a lot more we can do about that. And then we keep to focusing. Portfolio investment was much, much larger than foreign direct investment, but they vanished in March last year when the COVID came, and there was so much speculation, and there was not just speculation. The reality was that there was a lockdown, so a lot of that money left the country. But some of them are coming back now, looking for
right. So briefly now, because we're almost out of time, in terms of the solution to all of this, I know you're not going to wave a magic wand and everything is going to change, but what should Nigeria be focusing on? Should it be tightening its purse strings? What should it be doing to get the economy to rebound? If
you noticed today, Central Bank said we are raising 15 trillion naira for the infrastructure company of Nigeria. Already, the federal government has brought 1 trillion capitalization. They are heading out to the market for 15 trillion.
Right.
Now, that is a game changer. Okay. Because the major chunk of the borrowing is about infrastructure.
Okay.
Now, you now got a company you could push that over to, and government can focus on social inclusion agenda.
Okay. On that note, I want to thank you very much indeed, Professor Ken Ife, the macroeconomic policy analyst, lead consultant to ECOWAS, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. Thank you. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and around the world, bye-bye.